This is half of the cover of an issue of Cabinet magazine that we did a couple of years ago on the theme of forgetting. And this is a house in Detroit that's been covered completely by weeds, and you cannot see it anymore. And the particular impetus for putting together this panel came in part because of this issue that we worked on. And I wanted to just take 5 minutes to tell you a little bit about why we did the issue to begin with, because a lot of the questions and themes that we were considering and thinking about at that time is still live, and I think they're going to come up in this panel. I had gone, is this showing? Okay, enough of it that you can see. I had been to Texas a little while ago, and there in San Antonio, a number of friendly Texans had told me, I'm not a US person really, I became a citizen recently, told me a little bit about the history of the Alamo and what it means to remember the Alamo. And of course, having lived here, we also have another version of something like this with the many signs that are about never forgetting 9/11. And we live in a culture that always has specific events, usually traumatic, not always, that we are reminded always not to forget about. And then something unusual happened. I went to Quebec, to Montreal for a research project for a month. And unusually for me, I did zero research on the history of Montreal or Canada. I knew nothing. I parachuted in, and my very first day I noticed, oh, you can see that, that's great. I noticed that the license plates in Montreal, they say Je me souviens. But I was too embarrassed to ask right off the bat, what is it that you guys remember? What's the event? What's the, you know? So I held off. And with a couple of days left to go of the month, I had made enough friends that I felt comfortable saying to them finally, I gotta ask you, what is the event? And all of them said, we don't know. Don't know what it is this event refers to. And when I got home, I did a little bit of research on it, and it turned out that, pull out my research. No, it isn't, no. That would be a good candidate. It turns out that a guy called Eugène Etienne Taché was assistant commissioner for Crown Lands in Quebec, and he was the architect of the provincial parliament building, had the motto carved out in 1883 in stone below the coat of arms of Quebec. He came up with this on his own. And in his letters, he explained all kinds of details around the building, what each statue was supposed to stand for. He left some nooks, in fact, available for future statues. He had a whole historical thing worked out around the meaning of every fragment of this building, but he never told them what this particular thing referred to. The motto was very quickly adopted by Montreal, and very quickly after his own death, in fact, his contemporaries had no trouble interpreting its meanings. And in fact, a historian called Thomas Chappé, who was a civil servant, and a civil servant, Ernest Gagnon, gave a speech in 1895 where they said, the province of Quebec has a motto of which she is proud and which she likes enough to carve it on her monuments and palaces. This motto has only 3 words, Je me souviens. But these 3 words and their simple economy of expression are worth more than the most eloquent speeches. Yes, we remember. We remember the past and its lessons, the past and its misfortunes, the past and its glories. In other words, we remember everything that there is to be remembered, the past. And it has a very undefined object, even when they try to define it. And in part, the issue of cabinet came out of thinking around this, and this notion that there's an ethics of forgetting that is so profoundly at the heart of our cultures that we kind of think of forgetting as a kind of failure at this point. To not remember is a sort of a failure, and in part, the quote that you might have read that introduces this panel from Milan Kundera sets up a little bit why that would be, and that's because in the 20th century in particular, something that we might call repressive erasure has been at the heart of a whole number of political systems. And Kundera in the book of Laughter and Forgetting, is this visible?
Yeah.
Yes. has this line where he talks about the first step in liquidating a people is to erase his memory, destroy his books, his culture, his history. Then have somebody write new books, manufacture a new culture, invent a new history. Before long, the nation will begin to forget what it was, what it is, and what it was. The world around it will forget it even faster. The struggle of man against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting. So you can see why, in this kind of context, an ethics of memory would be so dominant and so fruitful. In our issue, we decided to explore other kinds of forgetting, and for this we turned to a guy called Paul Connerton, who's one of the founders of memory studies, who late in his career has turned to think about all the ways in which there are ethics of forgetting as well, and all the ways in which the word forgetting, the simple word forgetting, masks a whole number of different mechanisms done in the name of different projects by different agencies. And we kind of bundled them all together, and he thinks that it's not variegated enough, this word, or subtle enough to capture all the various things that go on under this name of forgetting. I will perhaps at some point during the discussion we can come back to some of those other modes. But I, for example, was surprised to know that at certain points in political history, the Greeks in 403, for example, did this, and this has happened also at the end of the 30 Years' War in 1814, 1815, when the French monarchy was restored. There were clauses placed into law that asked people to actually and actively forget what had happened in the period before in order to not have the cycle of vengeance and bloodshed continue. So, for example, in the Peace of Westphalia, clause number 2 asked the citizens of the countries to forget what had happened. It was an edict, forget. And that also happened in 1814 with Napoleon XVIII, and the Greeks in fact built an altar to forgetting in the Acropolis, because they realized that the civil wars that had just ended could never be finished unless an ethics of forgetting was also politically put in place there. So anyway, these are some of the many, many questions that thinking about what forgetting involves could raise, and there are a whole host more of those. So with those general remarks, we will now turn to our 3 distinguished panelists, and the order is going to be George first. Right, excellent. So on my right is George Prochnik, whose most recent book is In Pursuit of Silence, Listening for Meaning in a World of Noise. And prior to that, he wrote Putnam Camp, James Jackson Putnam and the Purpose of American Psychology, which was a New York Times editor's pick. And in addition to having written for the New York Times, the Boston Globe, and Playboy, he's a regular contributor, I'm happy to say, to Cabinet Magazine. And currently he's at work on a book about the supernatural and natural histories of Jerusalem. Please welcome George Prochnik.
Thanks very much. One thing to Sina's point, just to frame this a bit, I was interested to see just this past week that a major new study of sleep has come out. And whereas until quite recently, amidst all the vagaries of understanding what sleep exactly does for the brain, there was not a consensus, but there was certainly a wave of support for the notion that sleep was integral to locking in memories. There's now been a study that says that, in fact, perhaps even more importantly, it's about discarding key memories. And so it's about getting rid of, it's about selective forgetting. And I think we focus on this idea of selective memory, but maybe selective forgetting is, as Sina was pointing to in these historical instances, something that can be not only fertile, but in fact essential for the efflorescence of ourself as beings trying to, in some way, move forward in time. So I want to really briefly introduce a case history that I wrote about for Cabinet Magazine that touches on these kinds of dilemmas. The scene is the main cemetery in Turin in 1926. Police, making a routine patrol through the grounds of this large graveyard, discovered a man staggering dazedly between the graves. They ask him what he's doing there, and he cries out, "Oh, the war, leave me in peace, my family." They request to see his identity papers. He says he has none, and no recollection of who he is. To verify that he doesn't have any papers, one of the officers pulls open his coat, whereupon he immediately exposes a large bronze mortuary urn. And the man cries out, "I'm not a thief," but he seems unable in any way to identify himself beyond this fact. And the police dragged him off to the Colegno asylum as an amnesiac. The only thing that they had found in his pockets, outside of this very large urn within his coat, was a postcard that was signed, "Farewell from your beloved Giuseppino." So he enters the asylum, and he proved himself a model inmate. Everyone liked him. He was admirably zealous in his Catholicism, given to citing snippets of Nietzsche and Ovid. But after a year, unlike the vast majority of the many, many amnesiacs who entered this asylum, and in fact, many, many different sorts of mental institutions all across here after the war, doctors reported that there had been no progress at all in restoring his memory. And they were very frustrated because they had a good track record. So in a highly unusual step, the director of the institution published his photograph in a number of major Italian daily newspapers, and beneath it the caption, "Who knows this man?" Not long after this appeared, the photograph was seen by a woman named Giulia Cannella, who was an affluent woman from Verona, whose husband, a distinguished professor, had disappeared somewhere on the front line in the First World War, somewhere in Macedonia, and he was presumed to be dead. She immediately recognized this face and believed it was her husband, began a correspondence with the man. Everything seemed to check out. She showed the photograph to her sister. She said, "No doubt about it, it's him." And eventually she went off with her sister and a number of her intimates to Cologno to visit the amnesiac and to really put him to the test. The moment the amnesiac laid eyes on her and saw this entourage she brought with her of acquaintances from Verona, he was overcome, said witnesses, by these tremors of what was obviously very, very sincere emotion. He began crying, and everyone saw something electric happening. The widow was a bit more cautious, and she went back and forth in the asylum several times, asking him different sorts of questions that only her husband would have known the answer to. Believing she got answers to all those questions, she noticed that his beard was cut at the identical angle, his shoulders slumped in exactly the same way as her husband's had. He had a scar on his back that was the same one her husband had from a pleurisy operation. And eventually she resolved that it was him and embraced him. They both shed tears, and the amnesiac was discharged and sent back with her to recover at the family villa above Lake Garda. So it's a kind of beautiful story of wartime loss, marital fidelity, and this miraculous restoration of a patriot to life at the last moment. And so the amnesiac, Professor Cannella, as we now know, was enjoying the terrace in this beautiful home in the Italian Lake District and reminiscing with the family about his wartime service and recuperating. When 8 days after his release, the Turin police burst into the house and arrested him as a fraud and an imposter. And not only a fraud and an imposter, but a thief who had a record of stealing cemetery ornaments. He was dragged off to jail, and what was revealed to have happened was that in the same period that he was being identified by this widow, another woman from Turin named Rosa Negro had been informed by a group of typesetters who used to work with a man named Mario Brunero that they'd seen his photograph. She saw it, she said, "That's him," and he walked out on the family. This is certainly my husband. And she too had a son named Giuseppe. They marched off to the Turin police station to confront the amnesiac, Professor Canella. And the minute, and she went with her boy, Giuseppe. And the minute Giuseppe, the boy, saw this man, he rushed up to him, crying, "Papa, Papa," and embraced him. And the amnesiac sort of lurched back slightly and said, "Courage, my boy. Just as I have found my children, you will one day discover your father." And the testimony of Rosa Negro and the Turin typesetters was very convincing, but the widow, Signora Canella, did not budge at all on her position. The case was reopened, and what began was a 5-year saga of trials, appeals, counter-appeals. It electrified Italy and became a huge international media story. But what's particularly interesting is that with very few exceptions, throughout this long, exacting legal process, evidence just steadily mounted and mounted and mounted that in fact this was Mario Bruneri. There seemed to be no doubt, and in 2 years into the trial, it was in fact revealed that while the professor had been completely fluent in Latin and knew all sorts of different Italian dialects, outside of his little few Ovid quips, the amnesiac had no Latin whatsoever, knew no Italian except a Turinese dialect. He not only this, but he failed different kinds of, ultimately, fingerprint tests. Most damningly, it turned out that after he abandoned the family, he did go to Verona, got involved with a quarrel in which he stabbed someone with a penknife, was arrested, put in jail, his prints were taken, and his prints matched the amnesiac's prints as well as those of Mario Bruneri. None of this in any way dissuaded the widow Canella from believing that she was on the right side, and what's more, almost exactly 50% of the 100 witnesses who were eventually called took the side of her and the side of what became a cause célèbre for Verona, which never backed down, in fact became more and more fervent in support for the idea that this man was her lost husband. So the trial came to an end in 1931. He was sentenced finally to 4 years of imprisonment, but he was released after less than a year, went immediately back to Signora Canella, and the couple went off for Rio de Janeiro and lived happily ever after, as far as we know. He wrote a kind of Proustian memoir called In Search of Myself. And so what's going on here? And I'm going to say just a few words, but this is really something that I'd like to hear from the other distinguished panelists about, and anyone else. At the same time that this trial was taking place, and for the preceding decade, slightly more than a decade, following the First World War, there had been a rash of debates and investigations about the nature of amnesia, and in fact, really the nature of the mind, with more and less mechanistic explanations at war with each other. This was a time of enormous progress in the work of key neo-behaviorists, Clark Hall in particular, who started speaking of the human brain in very elaborate ways, more so than I think at any point in the past, analytically correct ways, about the brain as a machine, speaking of people as robots. There was a rush of effort to identify the human being entirely on materialist terms. Turin was representative for Italy of a whole sweep of modernist movements, we might say. I mean, technological movements. It's the birthplace of fiat and really of the network of Italian highways, superhighways that remain in place to this day. The birth of radio broadcasting. The futurists themselves, Marinetti, came out of Turin. Verona, by contrast, was this very conservative, religiously traditionalist city of tombs and poetry. And the more one reads the debate, the more it seems that really what Signora Canella is defending is a whole other interpretation of how we define identity. They had completely another epistemological model than that could be supplied by forensic evidence. And it's almost as though, at a certain point in the trial, the more accurate the forensic evidence became, the less it seemed credible to the Veronese who were defenders of the widow Canella. it becomes clear she was herself a very interesting character. She had gone off to America in search of a new life, but then retreated back to Italy, married this professor who was himself clearly something of a throwback. He could cite long passages of Horace, knew all of his odes by heart apparently, and was a classicist, a kind of brilliant classicist. She wore antiquated clothing, and in many ways tried to conduct her life along the lines of a culture that had vanished. And you can argue that what she was trying to do, perhaps, was to correct a larger societal amnesia that seemed to have forgotten a host of traditional values which might be grouped together under the ideas of the soul as opposed to the machine defining identity. And when she kept coming back to why she was so certain that this was her husband, she talked about, I know his moral self. I know his personhood. I know who he is on this kind of intimate level. So it was perhaps a rearguard action against this increasingly enveloping materialist culture that made it so difficult for the communication in the courtroom to even come to the point of arguing about the same thing. And just finally, I think we have to ask about the validity of that second approach, and the fact that for all the evidence that we have, Bruneri, or this person who had been Bruneri, did go on to live an exemplary life. It's true he had it easy, but he was in some way also transformed to a more civilized self than what had been available to him for whatever host of personal, psychological, and larger materialist economic reasons prior to this event. The sad moment, though, to remember in that more romantic view of things is that moment for me when Giuseppe runs forward to this man and he pulls back. So it's not quite clear what we should do with this morally, but I think it's an extraordinary moment, and I think we can say something about it.
Now we're going to ask Simon. Simon Critchley is Hans Jonas professor.
Is Hans Jonas.
At the New School for Social Research and a part-time professor of philosophy at Tilburg University in the Netherlands. His many books include Infinitely Demanding, Ethics, Politics, Subjectivity, The Book of Dead Philosophers, and most recently, The Faith of the Faithless. Please welcome Simon Critchley.
How is the, oh, that's great. Thank you, Sina. I've done 2 events at Penn this year. On Tuesday, I talked on memory, and tonight is on forgetting. Happily, I've forgotten everything that I said on Tuesday, and hopefully you will remember what I'm going to say now. How do we breed an animal with the right to make promises? How do we breed an animal with the right to make promises? For Nietzsche, yes, for him, bad boy Freddy, for Nietzsche, the human being is an originally forgetful creature, like a young child. So Nietzsche's view is we begin forgetful. To make this forgetful creature remember requires physical discipline. It requires punishment. The teaching of morality was never gentle. It never droppeth from heaven like gentle rain, as Portia says of the quality of mercy in The Merchant of Venice. On the contrary, if something is to be retained in memory, it must be burned in. The origin of memory lies in pain and cruelty. Man, Nietzsche says, could never do without blood, torture, and sacrifices when he felt the need to create a memory for himself. Nietzsche's first astonishing hypothesis in the second essay of The Genealogy of Morals is that the origin of concepts like responsibility and conscience lies in cruelty. Cruelty administered and maintained through a corporal and corporeal regime. Furthermore, religions are systems of cruelty, And as such, all forms of asceticism, all forms of ascesis, of disciplining of the self, which is Nietzsche's target in the genealogy, they originate in the same place. Consider the German punishments Nietzsche proposes. And we all know there's nothing quite like the German punishments. Stoning, breaking on the wheel, piercing with stakes, tearing apart or trampling with horses, boiling in oil, flaying alive, cutting straps from the flesh, smearing the wrongdoer with honey and leaving him to the flies in the blazing sun, poking with a sharp stick. Poke, German punishments. Nietzsche says, with magnificent understatement, with the aid of such images and procedures, one finally remembers 5 or 6 I will nots. Right? So how do we form an animal capable of keeping promises, of making promises, of being moral through a regime of cruelty? And that's how we burn in memory. On the basis of this burned in memory of cruelty, it's on the basis of that good, upright burghers such as ourselves acquired the habit of moral reasoning. Reason, seriousness, mastery over affects, the whole somber thing called reflection, all these prerogatives and showpieces of man, how dearly they had been bought. How much blood and cruelty lie at the bottom of all good things. Dearly bought. Hold on to that trope of purchasing. In another extraordinary passage of the second essay, Nietzsche explains the origin of thinking itself in terms of economic activity. Setting prices, determining values, contriving equivalences, exchanging. These preoccupied the earliest thinking of man to so great an extent that in a sense they are thinking. In the beginning was trade. Human activity begins with exchange, with the to and fro of buying and selling, which are forms of life older than other social alliances and organization. It's from here, Nietzsche insists, that human beings arrive at the first moral canons of justice. Everything has its price, all things can be paid for, he says, the oldest and most naive moral canon of justice. The beginning of all good-naturedness, all fairness, all goodwill, all objectivity on earth. Which brings us to the origin of das Bewusstsein der Schuld and schlechte Gewissen, the consciousness of guilt and bad conscience. Nietzsche's hypothesis is that the origin of guilty conscience lies in the relation between creditor and debtor. Gläubiger und Schuldner, he says. The spiritual concept of guilt, Schuld, originates in very material concepts of debts, Schulden. Guilt, in, say, St. Paul's sense, as the essential division of the Christian subject, a subject constituted by the guilt that divides it, for the good that I would, I do not, but the evil that I would not, that I do, Romans 7, lies in a fundamentally contractual relationship. The spirituality of Christian guilt is but the airy halo that floats over the materiality of a contract. In other words, morality begins with what our friend Shylock would call a bond. So Nietzsche's inquiry into the origin of morality takes him to memory, and memory is something burnt into us by physical punishment. Physical punishment that we then forget as we mouth words like mercy, love, and compassion. With that in mind, consider the meaning of punishment. The apparently self-evident, universal, and even natural idea that punishment is imposed because the criminal knew how to act virtuously, but acted viciously, and is therefore responsible for his crime, is a lie. On the contrary, for Nietzsche, punishment is necessary because the victim of the crime believed that the culprit could pay back their crime through their pain. That is, punishment is a corporeal payment for a criminal act that has nothing to do with something as ethereal as responsibility. The point is that the punishment of the criminal gives pleasure to the punisher. The punishment of the criminal gives pleasure to the punisher. This is why people believe in the death penalty, not because they think it is just, but because they are sadists. They want to administer some of those good old German punishments. And that much in Nietzsche is fantastic. Memory is something inculcated into us, burnt into us over centuries, millennia of human disfigurement that culminate in the emergence of morality. We've become such good moral beings that we no longer feel the pain anymore. On the contrary, we just feel the joy of love, compassion, respect, and the rest of the dreadful nonsense. In order to begin to throw this off, Nietzsche said, we must practice active forgetting. This is where forgetting comes in. We need to throw off the memory that's become second nature to us in order to recover a more primary nature. To forget, we need to forget our, it's Nietzsche's word, vivisection of ourselves in relation to ascetic ideals or whatever, and learn to laugh and forget. This is where Kundera gets this, I take it. The laughter here for Nietzsche is the laughter of a forgetfulness, a forgetful laughter, an affirmative laughter, a golden laughter, the laughter of Zarathustra, he says. The laughter of that person who teaches the overman. But I've never quite bought that part of the story. That laughter of forgetting sounds like the laughter of the mountaintops, 6,000 feet above man and time. It's alpine, it's Sils Maria. And I don't find this laughter at all funny. It's kind of desperate. And Nietzsche seemed to have forgotten himself so actively, and the ascetic practices ingrained in him by his Lutheran upbringing, that he's able to say, shortly before his final mental collapse in Turin, of himself, things like, why I am a destiny, why I write such excellent books, I am not a man, I am dynamite, Nietzsche says. Which is like saying, I'm a fucking genius. Oh, I just forgot myself. So, that bit I'm not so sure of. But there are other kinds of memory and forgetting that I'd like to ponder, which are on my mind. There's this story that George tells, and I think I've got a thought about that. Maybe we can pick that up in. So a movie came out recently. You know, that movie about the French guy in an orphanage who. The imposter, thank you. Who imposed himself on an American family whose son had disappeared. And there's this beautiful documentary that unravels that story. In a way, it's quite a similar case to the one you brought up. And, you know, people, it seems to me, will deny anything in order to hang on to their version of reality. What's extraordinary is the capacity to deny. But we can think about that. But where are we with memory and forgetting? I gave you the kind of Nietzschean story, which is, I like. But where we are now, I think there's a risk in, well, the following thing. If I look at my iPhone, my head empties, right? It's like a mental diarrhea, it just all evacuates. Or I watch TV, you forget. And it seems that we have outsourced memory into the interweb national thing, net object that we're celebrating the 20th anniversary of this very week. Memory has been outsourced into the internet, and soon everything that can be known will be available and we will know nothing. Right? Everything will be archived, available, documented, and we will know nothing. And it seems that we've switched, and this is where Nietzsche does come to mind, we've switched from an internal idea of memory, where memory was something that was ingrained, known by heart, that one memorized things, to an external idea of memory. It's out there, you just have to Google it. And this is a kind of passive forgetting rather than active forgetting. And that's, I think, where we are. And there's a real risk in that, namely that we become stupider and stupider in relationship to the fact there's more and more knowledge out there. But that knowledge we know is out there in some form that we can search, but it's external and not internal. And if you look at the history of memory and the history of, say, arts of memory, mnemotechnics, it's all about the cultivation of an inner memory, right, as being the key to education and all the rest. What it means to be a philosopher is to be able to remember, according to Plato. And I want to suggest, in a way, tentatively, that we then need to cultivate new arts of memory, new theatres of memory, new memory cabinets, archives for the arcane, the obscure, the ridiculous, and in every case, the useless. So my proposal would be to make a case for more useless memory, which means forgetting a lot. And perhaps then we need new forms of ascesis and asceticism. And I'd like to finish on a kind of a personal note, which is but there we are, I'm going to do it. The question of forgetting personally is odd, because when I was 18 years old, I was working in a pharmaceutical factory in Hitchin in Hertfordshire. It was an awful job. And but it was good that it was a pharmaceutical factory for reasons I'll say in a second. And well, not for the obvious reason, but we were making drugs for diabetics, or that's what we were saying. There's lots of white powder, though, it has to be said. But I was cleaning out a machine one day, and it's put your hand inside the machine, and someone turned the machine on. It was like a huge food mixer, sort of inch-thick metal paddles, and my hand was in there, and I pulled it out, and the thing almost came off and was put back on, and I had operations, and it's like this fucking weird thing here, which is, it still works more or less, but it's been a strange object to have at the end of my arm. The point of the story is that I kept my hand but forgot huge amounts, right? So I lost most of the memories of my childhood. Right? So what often happens in cases of trauma, right? You just erased. So for a long period of time, I remembered I had the capacity to speak and read and things like that, but I couldn't remember anything. And then you're in the situation, the weird situation, of asking for confirmation of things that happened to you in the past as a child, and looking at photos and saying, well, that's you, and you say, okay, I recognize that that's me, and you were doing this, and then you externally, you internalize that external memory, but of course with a skeptical doubt as to whether it's really yours, right? So there's this difficult, as it were, thorny epistemological issue, which is that if we are, as some people like to say, the sum of our memories, and if we lose those memories, then we are not, right? We know nothing, and we cease to be. And that then raises the question of what it would mean in the case of this, the case that George raised, to be forgetful like that. That one has to reconstruct a memory from nothing. And what is that? That is a kind of second self, which is always going to be some kind of simulacrum of the first self. And that's weird. Because the reason is, I mean, the consequence of that is you're never quite sure whether you are who you are, or whether you are indeed an imposter, which, of course, I could be this evening. That's for you to decide.
Thank you, Simon. And our last presenter is Barbara Frischmuth, who was born in 1941 and lives in Steiermark, Austria. She studied Turkish, Hungarian, and Middle Eastern studies, and has worked as a writer, translator, and columnist, as the author of a large number of books, and has won numerous prizes for many of those books. Please welcome Barbara Frischmuth.
Good evening, everybody. Well, I have to apologize at the beginning for my English. I'm not a native speaker and I don't live in an English-speaking surrounding, so I try to do my best. And I'm not a professor. I'm just a writer of novels and other things. So I'm very glad that I did not start with Nietzsche. I was lured to do though, because my husband, a psychiatrist who is the philosopher in the family, advised me to start with these scenes from Nietzsche. Well, I thought I wouldn't be able to translate them just like this. So I start with Herodot. And the story about the most important tragedist of his time, Frischmuth. And Frischmuth wrote the tragedy about Milet being occupied and destroyed in 494 by the Persians. And then he wrote the tragedy about it, and when it was performed a few years later, it was a shock to the people, and he made them cry with this tragedy. And after that, he was put to court for having brought bad memories to the people of Athens, and they charged him with a high fee. So, and there was a little bit later a law where you could be sent to trial if you tried to do things like this. So that's about memory in ancient Greek. Being an Austrian, Austria always was blamed, and rightly blamed, for forgetting. You know, the famous operette that says, happy is who forgets what you can't change anymore. So I think Austria, especially the post-war Austria, tried hardly to forget. And there were some reasons because they could do it to a certain extent, because there was the Moscow Declaration in 1943 that granted Austria to be, a state again, the state of Austria after the war, to end the occupation by Germany. And but Austria should do something for itself, I mean, to show its will to be a state again. And the other legend was that, of course, Austria was the first country that was occupied by Germany. That's true, but many Austrians wanted to be occupied. I mean, they wanted to come to Germany because they couldn't live up, they just couldn't accept the the monarchy coming to an end, and they didn't believe in really surviving as this small state. But this turned out to be a legend, and Austria survived, but this surviving was based partly on a great forgetfulness. I mean, people tried to forget what they did during wartime, what they did to the Jews, and all these things, just for getting the power to be a nation. Young writers at the end of the 50s, tried to change this forgetting into memorizing. And when I remember, I was born in 41, so I know this period quite well. And I know how the young intellectuals at the end of the 50s and throughout the 60s try to really confront with their parents. And this was really something that made both parts aggressive, or they didn't even, or they got mute, and they didn't even talk with each other. So I remember the time, when especially the young intellectuals being in confrontation with the generation before them, they started to try to build something entirely new, especially as far as art is concerned. And because the young people had to live up with all the losses they suffered throughout the war, the intellectual losses. They were cut from information what avant-garde had done in the other European countries and in America. So when we started to read seriously in the late 50s and then in the 60s, we had on the one hand all these worn out, semi-fascistic literature that still went on, written by persons that were not, that hadn't made their hands dirty in killing, people, but they still were in a fascistic way and surrounding. And we and the generation, my generation, and the ones being at least 10 years older than me, we tried at first to get information about all what happened, about avant-garde, about surrealism, about Dadaism, about poésie concrète, about Joyce, about I don't know what. And but we couldn't get the books. It was on the one hand, they were not printed in our countries, or only very, very slowly they started to edit books like from the avant-garde. And on the other hand, when they were on the market, they were so expensive that we could hardly buy them. I mean, in this group were people like Peter Handke, and Thomas Bernhard was living at the same time, but he never was in any sort of group. We hadn't the consciousness of being a group. We were only named 10 years later, the group of Graz. But we tried to read together. I mean, we all bought books and gave it on, I remember Peter Handke reading to me As I Lay Dying from Faulkner. I mean, what I wanted to say is we had to live up to European standard, and we were very busy with it. And the past and all the crimes were in our mind because we tried to read about it, but it seemed somehow almost impossible, to confront with what our parents did. And I, for my person, I was quite lucky because my father had been declared political unreliable, and they sent him very quickly to the front, and my mother, didn't even talk with the ones trying to get her into the party. But even in the families, the people that had really been courageous were not mentioned very often. And I remember an uncle of mine, that means I don't remember him because he was killed by the illegal Nazis at the Putsch in 1934 when he was not even 19. And he was shot, and nobody dared to get my father and my grandma there to identify him. Only an Englishman, the best friend of my father, he went with them, and so they could identify him. But Herbert was the one who was very seldom mentioned. I mean, he died 7 years before I came to the world, so for me he was no real memory. It was just something I heard of, you know. Then my father and two of his brothers died too in World War II, but they were mentioned more than the first one. But you know, my grandparents had to come over this. I mean, to lose 4 sons in a dirty war without any sense. So it was, for me, when I grew up, you know, it was like a wall. You were listening to it, you didn't know all of them. I didn't know my father, all the others. And you didn't develop a feeling for these deaths. I mean, you just heard about them, and it was cruel, and you preferred not to think too much for them because, well, they were gone. And the others that really had been courageous, like there was a kind of partisan group in the place where I live, that's Sils Maria of Austria, the place where I come from. You know, they were not mentioned too. Only now, during the 1980s, people undertook really to try to remember and to do something about their history. And I think that many of my colleagues still are busy with trying to confront themselves with what had happened. And well, but I don't want now to go on because that was my piece I could say about the benefits of forgetting. I mean, I don't believe in the benefits, but anyway, it happened like this.
So we have roughly exactly 34 minutes before we need to wrap up. We would like to open it up to questions very soon, but maybe before that, I wondered if there are other questions within the panel that people might have for each other. Yeah.
Well, I just wonder what 2 quick ones for George. Why that story? What's on your mind with that story? What's the compulsion? You know, the way you told it was fascinating, but what is what's at stake?
Well, I think certainly one aspect speaks directly to your remarks and in a way to Barbara's. Mario Bruneri's story as an individual is not especially interesting. As you started to say near the end, I think people will deny anything in that. He sort of represents that more than anything. But the use that was made by the collective, by, in a sense, the memory of the group, of his story. In this case, this community that was threatened by the rupture of the war and a larger transformation of values. It seemed that there was some fertility there. You know, one can't dismiss his imposterhood entirely beyond himself. So that question of where, not his externalized memory. Certainly he did reconstruct a memory from scratch based on what was going to be useful to expropriate from other people's stories. But how that enabled other forms of deep memory to be sustained against the threat of this larger mechanistic model, which in a way is culminates in the kinds of technologies that we depend upon today is interesting. And I think that, just for a second to speak to your remarks, that idea of the necessary also this lag in time between engagement and allowing a period of memory's abeyance, while it feels morally abhorrent, you know, instinctively, is it possible for a society? I mean, I'm asking it as a question, and I'd like to know what Simon you think and Barbara. But can a society reconstruct itself without that lag? And certainly the fact that the Bruneri Canella story doesn't take place until 1926, and that this is really when this wealth of thinking about amnesia and about remembrance, and whether amnesia, and one big strain of thought certainly in the popular analysis of amnesia up until this point had been that it was an act of will and that it was shirking responsibility. There's lots of stuff in the American press. There were a series of interesting articles in popular science with titles like Missing, speaking about an entire fifth column of amnesiacs who were lurking in the countryside, somewhat in a manner of invasion of the body snatchers, who were just trying to escape the masculine embrace of truth. So yes, I'd like to hear both of your responses to those fragments.
It is like invasion of the body snatchers. What's going on now with the Boston bombers is a kind of incredibly sustained effort to make these people somehow other, to find some narrative which allows us to declare them as those people over there. It's kind of extraordinary. I have a question, which is the because there's a kind of problem here, which is my problem in relation to the panel, which is basically I'm a memory person. I think memory is a good thing, and so my question to Barbara would be, which I think is a kind of rhetorical question. I think you know what you'd say, but the anecdote that you began with about the tragic poet who was exiled for reviving bad memories. You say, well, then is the duty of the writer to bring back bad memories? I think you probably, I think it is. But I guess, and that's good, absolutely. But then, I guess, at what point it's the risk of memory becoming memorialization, becoming a kind of feeling that we feel it even when we don't feel it. Right? We learn the affect. We learn to even fake the affect of concern, and so there's a kind of problem out there in cities like this one of memorialization. Right?
I just want to say I think that's a really interesting point, and of course there was a sustained effort in the immediate years after Hitler became the chancellor in Germany to erect memorial posts along different points in the boundary, recording loss of life and trying to very visibly recover and enshrine and fetishize specific memories of loss, but also not to let them slip, not to let them be forgotten.
Yeah.
Under a never again, one could say, kind of a mantra. That's that whole idea of never again is certainly very problematic. First, that it doesn't really mean anything.
Yeah.
But second, that, philosophically, you can speak to the issues of repetition in memory, and what Kierkegaard, who I know had some similar thoughts to Nietzsche about memory in the past also impeding being in the present, and what constitutes a destructive form of repetition, and what form of just repetitiveness of our biological being is about the epic embrace of life.
So for me, I think about all these things. We brought up tragedy, and for me, I think about all these things in relationship to something like tragedy, sacrificing his daughter in order that the ships of the Argives might have favourable wind to go to Troy to engage in a war, and then Orestes killed Agamemnon because to avenge him, and then it goes on. And it seems that who knows what Aeschylus is up to in the Oresteia, but it's something about the repetition, right? The repetition of a trauma. So it's not that never again, it's again, right? Again. But there can be something, let's say a work of art, a tragedy, which can depict the suspension of violence, right? Without negating its history, and without this is crucial. Without negating, if you like, its complex, ambiguous history. Because what's so powerful about Greek tragedy is that it's never clear where the truth lies. The truth is divided between two parties who are in conflict. One is not being asked to remember, as it were, the victims, and it's never that clear in the Greek. So what one is being asked to remember is a complex situation, and the best we can do in relationship to that is perhaps suspended in an artwork where it becomes language and something else. I don't know what you think about that.
Well, I think it starts with trying to keep it from your soul just to survive. Then there comes the process where you try to put it in black and white. That's the most aggressive phases, and it led to 68 here. And then it starts, at least in Austria, it started in the 80s, really to try to find out what happened and to see the shades of grey. I mean, not the ones
Not the 50.
but to try.
But we all wish we'd written that.
And then it starts to get interesting, I think, And at the beginning, that I said that even the really courageous people, like my uncle, and then an aunt who got even a tree in Yad Vashem because she was hiding Jews, were, I think, outcasted somehow because they brought shame over the other. The others they shamed the others. That's why they were kind of not really being taken serious, and they always said people had excuses, and sometimes really these people are not very convenient people, not very nice people. So-called heroes mostly are not the ones you would like to have as friends. And I translated the concentration camp diary in 1967 from a Hungarian Jewish woman, and I met her, and I spent a week with her in closure because she didn't want to talk about the book personally. We were just discussing translation problems, and for me it was really like being in a big disease. And I did it, and of course I had more knowledge than most of the others in my age. But at this time, nobody was interested in the book. No, it was published by Robert. I thought, people might just run after it. No, it wasn't. That didn't interest anyone. Only years later, there came, I think, a few years ago, there came a new edition. I translated it from Hungarian. The person migrated to France from Germany then. She came from Siebenbürgen, from from Romania, but the Hungarian part of Romania. And then it was translated from French, and it had much more success than in '67, when nobody wanted to read it.
And I like very much that idea of a process in these different stages. It makes me think also of, there's the essay by Freud that's repetition, remembering, and working through, and sort of trying to distinguish between those, what it is to enact, to re-inhabit, and what it is to distance enough that one actually enlarges one's understanding of oneself and one's relationship to the memories that are so burdensome. And I also, I wonder just for a second, going back to the technology in terms of this, what do you think, how do you think our new investment in the notion of transparency, constant transparency, sort of the idea of an eternal present, how does that play into the elements of necessary process in terms of assimilating experience and trying to, the fear of an entirely externalized self through these devices to undo?
I mean, it kind of terrifies me. I mean, the culture of transparency in all its different manifestations. You know, it's I long for the opaque.
I'm with you.
I long for the opaque and the invisible and the undocumented and the unremembered in that sense. It's, in a sense, it's a kind of, you know, on my worst days, you know, we're constructing a perfect prison house, it seems to me. That's the flip side of this. On my good days, you think it's fantastic that you can find archives or this and that and the other, and you can have instant access to the most extraordinary things. I mean, you know, book searches or whatever it might be, or things which would have taken, you know, enormous labour. Yes, but there's a kind of we suffer from a kind of myth of transparency, I think. And one of the things that, for me, literature or theatre is about is not that. Is a kind of pushing at something opaque, something there which speaks, but we don't quite know where it's speaking from, or even who it's addressing us in a language we barely understand. And that's what compels us. And that's not transparent, right? It's not.
I mean, it reminds me of another aspect of that case that I thought was amazing, was when the fingerprint evidence was presented to Canella and her lawyers. The point that was argued was not that the fingerprints, there were 2 points, not that the fingerprints weren't real, but first of all, that in the understanding of fingerprints, while it was highly probable that 2 people wouldn't have identical fingerprints, it wasn't impossible.
Mm-hmm.
And secondly, that maybe the widow began to argue that perhaps the crime had been committed in fact by her husband, but in a transformed state caused by the amnesia of the war, that he had actually become someone else. So this pushing towards a bit of a core mystery, that desire for something to linger that is not made transparent, I think was the same urge, you know, that was driving the non-forensic side of things. Yeah.
Well, I liked your idea about this memory being delegated to the computer, because that's the thing. I really feel that nobody is really knowing any longer something. You know, because it's so easy. You push a button and you have the whole material. But what I see around me is that people really don't know anything anymore by heart or so, you know. Not a poem, nothing, you know, because it's so easy to get your information. Mm-hmm. And what is so easy most of the time is not appreciated very much. So I'm afraid that knowledge is going to be less appreciated more and more.
It's like going to Proust with memory. And then Proust's whole argument about when desire works is the inaccessible, right? And so if the minute that's gone, there's no passion, really, there's no love, the sense of accessibility, absolute accessibility. And if we equate in some way the drive to understand as such, to investigate the past, to investigate personal and national and transnational history, the sense that it's all there reduces any potency to our interest.
I was very disappointed today because I had a garden workshop here, and when I started engaging in gardening and I wrote 3 garden books, I had to write the name of plants. I read a lot of English material, hortus and I don't know what, so I could hardly find the names of plants in my dictionaries, even when they were that thick. I had really to find out the Latin name and then show up the Latin in my old Latin or plants dictionary. And then from Latin I could deduce the German version. Mm-hmm. Since I am on the road, I use an iPad. And I press a button and the name is there. Names that I never found in my dictionary. But the others one I still know. This
right?
one I forget for in the next minute.
Right.
So this could go on for obviously a while. We have, however, only 16 minutes now. And the 16 minutes, I was wondering if we can open up to the audience. Question over there.
Thank you. I guess we've already learned that access is neither knowledge nor wisdom, but I would like any of you who would care to comment on a prime example of the conundrum or the dilemmas or the conflicts between both memory and forgetting that happened most recently in our international history. And that is the Truth and Reconciliation Committees in the Union of South Africa that talked about what we can remember, what we can forget, what we can let go, what we must.
I think what was interesting about the Truth and Reconciliation Committees was the suspension of the suspension of juridical questions, right? So in a sense, the what makes possible
Motive and forgiveness.
Yeah.
Were
Yeah.
two things that were part of that process.
Which is possible in a culture like South Africa, where there is a Christian. That idea, a strong idea of forgiveness, I think, is driving that. It's it's a very good example of the way in which a memory can be worked through. Another one which comes to mind would be Ireland, and that's one that I was I'm from a mixed up kind of background, so foot in both camps, as it were. But but seeing how, in a sense, there has been, the problem in situations of conflict, say the Irish one, or indeed in the former Yugoslavia, is a kind of excess of memory, or an excess of certain kinds of memory, right? And that memory becomes a justification for violence. This is legitimate because of what happened, whatever. And it's. But there is, for me, I mean, the Irish situation in Northern Ireland is extraordinary insofar as, what would have been inconceivable a generation ago, namely a cycle of largely sort of vengeance killing, legitimated by different ideas of memory, has been suspended into speech, into parliamentary speech, where the Ulster Unionists and the members of Sinn Féin sit down in the same room. They're not friends, they don't like each other, but there's been a suspension of that. I think it's possible. It's possible. And that means a certain reorganization of memory.
Question here?
Yeah, I want to pick out something that actually is from the slide. One of the, when I first read George Orwell's 1984, the thing, when I was a kid, the thing that really affected me the most was the way they remade memories. They remade the past. And I remember the slogan, who controls the present controls the past, who controls the past controls the future. So they were trying to convince people not what is, but what was. So I was wondering if you could talk about something which wasn't talked about as much, which is the manipulation of memories for particular political interests or other kinds of interests. And certainly the remaking of nations and so on.
This is a photograph doctored by Stalin after Trotsky, who was there right next to Lenin, was removed later on. There's a whole host
and then
of these
convincing people, not only isn't he there, he never
was
existed.
there.
Yeah, anybody want to?
I'm saying too much. You go ahead. After you. After you.
Well, somebody, you're all interesting. Anyone's going to have something interesting to say.
Sina. I mean, it's funny. When I think of Orwell now, I always think of how what he couldn't foresee would be how desperately our desire to be seen would trump our fear of being surveilled. That the idea that there would be a Big Brother reality show, and that our need to sort of to feel that we exist, that we're being watched, that we're in the present now. That this would obviate the need for people to care about personal dignity, obviously, but also sort of what kind of what kind of an inner life they could have. I think that maybe this moment now, where the whole question of interiority has become, it's so jeopardized from many different perspectives, I think raises a whole host of issues about manipulation of the past in the ways that this photograph or something did. I think it's a really fast. My instinct would be it's a really fast changing landscape. Our investment, everything is so doctored. Everything is at once available and coming from. I mean, so I had conversations immediately in the wake of the Boston bombing with a number of people who spoke to me about all of the sites that they were on, which had evidence of coincidences that day that showed that this had been a justification for the FBI to lock down Boston and do a kind of surveillance that had never been conducted, a class-based warfare. And so much seems up for grabs that I think the question is terrifying now. That, whatever, if we think about how minimal this intervention was on this photograph compared to what you can do now.
Yeah.
Yeah. Question there?
Yeah, I would just say two things. One comment is that we certainly are inundated with data and the accessibility to data, but that's a far cry different from what knowledge is.
Mm-hmm.
So data we have, knowledge we perhaps have less of. But I wanted to speak to this notion, these aphorisms that we've been taught. One is that those who don't remember or learn from history are bound to repeat it, and also that history is written by the victors.
Mm-hmm.
And so the question I have is that if it's not never again, if it's always again and again, is there ever a moral or ethical utility to purposely forgetting, to making a conscious choice to forget permanently, as opposed to just having that, as Barbara spoke to, that period where you forgot just so you could survive?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think we forget, in a sense, we forget, and the past acts through us, right? I mean, what is it? If you, when you're being an arsehole, right? When I'm being an arsehole, which happens frequently, probably the same thing. It would be, when you get into a rage with someone you love, someone a cab driver or something like that. In a sense, you're forgetting. Something is acting through you, right? Which is deep. Something's coming through you. Which is all that stuff, which is there, which you can reflect on and be, reflective and modest. But when the time comes, it will whoop. And like Oedipus on the road back from the oracle at Delphi, he raises his hand and kills the older man who is his father, knowing that it's his father, not knowing it's his father, and sort of knowing it's his father. So the power of forgetting is, so there's a sense of forgetting which is still that the past acts through you. And I guess for me, I'm a big fan of Paul Thomas Anderson in general. But that line from Magnolia, as the man says, or as the book says, you may be through with the past, but the past isn't through with you. That's what I tend to think. The past isn't through with us. And so to declare oneself through with the past is a disavowal which just is going to bring violence rushing back. So for me, it's for me the most important thing that there is for me, is history in that sense, right? And the labour of historians, I think of what I do at my best as a kind of intellectual history or whatever it might be, an attempt to give voice to something that wasn't voiced in some way, and that's always going to be a kind of a botched edge. So to push that even further, I think that I find the future completely uninteresting. The discourse on the future is always is a future that's going to resemble the present with faster internet connections, right? It's a kind of the future's the present just a bit better, And the future for me is always a kind of ideological trope. And so I think the discipline of whatever you call it, I call it, let's say, being on the left, whatever that means in 2013, is to ignore the future and to cultivate the past as a way of affecting the present. Right? So for me, it becomes a question of trying to archive or unearth forms of memory that have been silenced, right? And complexity which have been silenced as a way of, and that's a kind of, yeah.
But what would interest me, when can you speak of the past as history? I mean, in former times it was when everybody had died, that
right.
Then you could call it past. But now we are much quicker with this, with past. And that's why there are so many versions of past, I think.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
sorry, no. I mean, I also, I mean, very much to your point that the past acts through us. One of the most, I mean, to switch the scenes. One of the most interesting areas of research now in Alzheimer's is not looking at trying to cure, but is in fact working with elements of personal history that still exist somatically in many cases within the patients. And there's a clinic that, for example, is having apparently enormous success where, to take one small story, there was a man who every night he would sit down at the dinner table with everyone and just start screaming and punching and behaving in these ways. And no one had thought to look at his story at all. He was in a large facility. And it turned out that he had been a military officer, and he was used to being served first. And by doing that little bit of archaeology, the people began serving him first. And he completely became pacified and became calm and became pleasant. A little bit of attention to the ways that the past continues to act through, even when so much of it has been degraded and lost, transformed the emotional affect of this person in the present, to your point, in ways that were very profound for the whole community of people that he was part of.
Anyone here not being served yet? We have time for one more question.
I wanted to ask you about, I was really intrigued by going back to the amnesia story, which I have not forgotten. The role of the scar. I thought that was fascinating. I don't know anything about pleurisy. I don't think any of us here ever had pleurisy. But that... You did? That the scar was there. You know, that the mark on the body. So Simon, for instance, if you're not sure who you are, you look down at your wrist, and then you see that scar and you know who you are. So I'm just wondering about the role of the scar in the mark on the body.
Well, I mean, clearly the mark
like
on the body...
I mean, was Odysseus when he came back? You know, he had the scar. Maybe it wasn't.
I mean, I think that's a really good point, and it gets into the question of just how fungible the self can be, even when there are marks. I mean, clearly her husband had some kind of mark, and it must have looked something like that. But that this sort of physical evidence is not in itself enough to define the self. You know, it's not sufficient. Even the stigmata of a life don't add up to an identity. The stigmata on the body. So. Yeah, it's interesting that there was this overlap, but it meant nothing for a literal identification of the two people. I don't know, do you have? I mean, that idea of a physical traces. I mean, that's of course there's such interesting work that Cabinet has looked at as well about sort of different approaches to in the former Yugoslavia, but looking at what it means to dig up remains and how these can be used, and the advisability of these forms of corporeal memory. The use that can be made of them seems to be just as manipulable as the faintest traces of our words, I think, in the...
A wonderful novel by Michael Ondaatje, Unexposed. That's still
yes.
It's 8:29. We're coming in 1 minute early. Unless somebody wants to have a quick, not even a question.
German by any chance?
Yes, you have 1 minute.
I just want to say, I'm so glad that you mentioned Alzheimer's, because I don't know, for me it was beginning to feel like a sort of elephant in the room in a way, given the statistics that we're hearing about how many people are affected, let's say secondhand, by someone they know, above all family members who are affected in some way by Alzheimer's. I don't even really have a question. I just
That's good.
It was so in a way it was so good to hear that one little reference to it, especially this kind of new way of thinking about treating it. I think I know that the Alzheimer's Society, for instance, is vehemently opposed to this kind of accepting, in a way, of there's some sort of idea of inclusion and that their opinion should always be taken into consideration, but without necessarily this kind of approach. I think
Yeah, well, I mean, my mother has dementia currently, and she's in a facility that doesn't work this way, and I can say that knowing something about this other model, it's a terrible thing that it's being ignored or not recognized, that these individuals have pasts which inform them, however many details have been lost, inform their emotional lives, and must be recognized if we want to bring any kind of greater peace, or even not peace, but at least I guess it's solace in some minimal fashion.
Okay, on that note, thank you all for coming, and please join me in thanking all